Chapter 9. "What was that all about?" Jessica demanded, staring down at the mess on the front hall floor. Elizabeth gasped. "Oh, Jess, your flowers." "I'll go and see if she's okay," Stephen said anxiously, hurrying into the living room after Suzanne. "Let me help you," Elizabeth said to her sister, bending over to pick up a jagged piece of glass. "I'll get some paper towels," Jessica said. "Be right back."
"Do I look horrible or something?" Todd asked Elizabeth, his brow wrinkling. "Or should I just get used to the fact that people drop faces when they see me?"
"Suzanne's a little tense," Elizabeth whispered. "It isn't your fault, Todd." Jessica returned with the paper towels, and the three of them quickly cleaned up the floor. As they were finishing, Suzanne came out of the living room. "I'm so sorry, Jessica," Suzanne said, taking a deep breath. Stephen had his hand on her shoulder, but she was still trembling violently. "I don't know what got into me. I'm just really jumpy for some reason. Hi, Todd," she added, giving Todd a weak smile. Jessica shot Suzanne a scrutinizing glance. "Maybe you better go lie down, Susie. You look pale." "I'm okay," Suzanne said, rubbing her temple with one hand. "I've just been getting these headaches lately, and they make me kind of dizzy." Jessica raised her eyebrows at her twin. "Headaches?" she thought. "That's what happens when you swallow half a medicine cabinet with your coffee every morning." Elizabeth looked down in dismay at her chinos, which were soaking wet from the daisies she just carried into the kitchen. "Todd, I'm going to run upstairs and change," she said. "What time did you tell the Egberts we'd be over?"
"Any minute," Todd told her. "We better go as soon as you've got dry clothes on." "I'm taking off," Stephen said, "so I better say goodbye to you now, Todd."
Stephen was meeting some old friends for a football game and was already 20 minutes late.
"Will you be back tonight?" he asked Todd, shaking his hand warmly. "Sure," Todd said. "I want to say hello to your parents. And Liz and I have a date."
Jessica followed her brother out to the garage, the rest of the broken glass in a garbage bag in her hands. "Steve," she said in a low, urgent voice.
"What is it?"
"What do you think's going on with Suzanne? Is it normal to get the shakes like that before lunch?"
Stephen shook his head. "Lay off, Jess. The girl's got a right to be high-strung the way you're harassing her."
Jessica glared at her brother, shoving the glass deep into the trash can in the garage and spinning on her heel. No matter what Stephen thought, Jessica was convinced that something was definitely wrong. Suzanne just didn't seem normal, and Jessica was determined to find out exactly what was going on with Suzanne once and for all. When Stephen and Jessica had gone out to the garage, Todd and Suzanne were left alone together in the front hall.
"Come in the kitchen with me for a second,"
Todd whispered to Suzanne, looking anxiously upstairs to try to judge from the sounds how close to being ready Elizabeth was. Suzanne followed him into the kitchen, still trembling a little. "Todd, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I had no idea you were coming to town. I don't know. I guess you just sort of surprised me," she concluded weakly.
"Listen, Suzanne," Todd said in a low voice, looking around him nervously. "I forgot to mention to Liz that you and I ran into each other in Killington. Somehow I just got sidetracked, and I'm afraid now it'll seem like..."
His voice trailed off, and he stared at her helplessly. "Do you want me to not mention it too?" Suzanne asked.
"Maybe you'd better not," Todd sighed. "It's kind of dumb, but still..."
"Todd," Suzanne said sincerely, putting her hand on his arm and staring up at him with the sweetest, most serious expression he'd ever seen. "I'll do whatever you think is best. As it is, I've made such a mess of things." Jessica froze, her hand on the doorknob. She was standing just outside the half-open door, and she couldn't believe what she was seeing and hearing. "Todd," she had distinctly heard Suzanne saying, "I'll do whatever you think is best. As it is, I've made..." Just then, Stephen started his car, and the rest of what Suzanne was saying was lost in the noise of the engine. "That little rat," Jessica thought furiously. Everything had suddenly become perfectly clear to her. No wonder Suzanne was so tense. No wonder she'd dropped the vase. And no wonder she was so eager to come out to Sweet Valley when she could have been in St. Moritz, having the time of her life. Suzanne Devlin was in love with Todd, and from the sound of it, Todd was hot on her, too. Jessica shuddered, straining to hear more conversation between them. But the next minute she saw them walking out of the kitchen and then heard the cheerful sound of Elizabeth's voice in the entrance hall. Trembling with rage, Jessica went into the kitchen. That sneaky, conniving rat. First she stole my sister's necklace, now she's trying to steal her boyfriend. Jessica couldn't help remembering Saturday night when she'd asked Elizabeth what she'd do if Todd fell in love with another girl. Elizabeth had looked horrified. She might not have said as much, but Jessica knew the answer. She'd die. That's what she'd do, Jessica told herself. Oh, Liz, Jessica moaned aloud, her hand over her mouth. Imagine how her poor twin would react if she found out Todd had fallen in love with Suzanne. Jessica had always suspected Todd might do a low-down, rotten thing like this. Sure, he seemed like a wonderful guy on the surface, but she'd suspected for a while now that he wasn't as great as he seemed. Still, she couldn't really put all the blame on Todd. No doubt Suzanne had gotten her hooks into him, and he'd gotten trapped. She could tell just by looking at Suzanne that she was an operator, the kind no guy could resist. That didn't mean that Jessica forgave Todd. He didn't have the right to do anything behind Elizabeth's back. But Suzanne was the one Jessica wanted to get back at. She was the one who had done her best to wreck the Christmas vacation so far, and now it looked as if she intended to make more of a mess of their lives than anyone had anticipated. Only, Jessica vowed, I'm not going to let her. If Suzanne thinks she can get Todd, she's got another thought coming. Because, Jessica vowed to herself, grabbing the phone book and racing upstairs to her room, I'm going to get her first. What's up, Jess? Winston asked, plopping down beside her on her striped beach towel. Yeah, what's with all the mystery? Aaron demanded, stretching his own towel out beside hers. You sounded like something really serious was going on over there this morning. It was, Jessica said grimly, and still is. It was 2:30, the time the three of them had agreed on for their emergency meeting at the beach. Jessica was killing two birds with one stone, using the strong rays of the sun to pick her tan up a little so she'd look more smashing than ever in her new blouse on Friday night. It had never really been misplaced after all. She'd just hidden it in the back of Elizabeth's closet to keep Suzanne on her toes. I can't thank you guys enough for coming to my rescue, she began, running a handful of sand through her fingers. That girl is unbearable, she sighed. Ugh, absolutely unbearable. What's she done now? Winston asked sympathetically. Jessica took a deep breath and began to list the atrocities Suzanne had committed since she'd arrived the day before. She was stretching the truth a little, but it was all for a good cause. To begin with, I'm sure she's on drugs, Jessica said. Aaron looked startled. You're kidding, really? Positively, Jessica assured him. She's even having dizzy spells now. Wow, Winston said. What kind of drugs? Have you seen any? Pills, Jessica told him, all sizes and colors. She must carry about 137 pounds of them around all the time. And she looks really terrible, too. Liz says she's lost weight. I thought she was anorexic before I figured out that she's just high all the time. Incredible, Aaron said. Well, what else? Has she been really rotten? The worst, Jessica assured him. You wouldn't believe how rude she is. She talks about Sweet Valley like it's some little hick town. All she can do is compare it to Manhattan. You'd think we all lived in one big barn, for God's sakes. Winston looked furious. You see, Aaron, that's just what she said before, after we'd been so nice to her. I can't believe it. Aaron looked thoughtful. Anything else, Jess? Jessica thought fast. I'm too embarrassed to tell you, she murmured. Come on, Aaron begged her. I really shouldn't, Jessica began, lowering her eyes. But one little fib was nothing, she told herself, if it kept her twin's heart from being broken. Just as she'd hoped, Aaron couldn't stand the suspense. "Tell me," he begged. "Well," Jessica sighed, "she said the guys out here were horrible. She said you were all really crass and that none of you knew anything about making a girl happy. And—" "That's enough," Aaron said darkly. "I think I've heard just about as much as I can stomach." "What can we do, Jess?" Winston demanded. "I don't know about Aaron, but I'm willing to do anything you want, if you can think of a good way to get rid of her." "Nothing too drastic," Aaron warned. "All we really want to do is make her feel unwanted, right?" "That's it," Jessica said suddenly, snapping her fingers. "I just had a terrific idea. How would you two like to be Suzanne's secret Santas?" Winston's eyes lit up. "But instead of doing nice things, we'll do terrible things, right?" "Jessica Wakefield," Aaron said admiringly. "That's the best rotten plan I've heard in a long time." "I thought she'd like it," Jessica said. She didn't dare tell Aaron or Winston her suspicions about Todd and Suzanne. She'd never heard Elizabeth like that. It would be all over town in a matter of minutes. No, the subtle, underhanded way was far, far better. This way, Jessica told herself, Suzanne was bound to get the idea that no one in Sweet Valley could stand having her around for another minute. And maybe then she'd get lost and leave Todd Wilkins to Elizabeth. All I can say, Jessica told herself, is that she'd better, because Suzanne the Devil never knew what trouble was before. Later that afternoon, Jessica was lying on her stomach on a lounge chair by the pool, taking a nap. She was having a wonderful dream, too. In it, she looked gorgeous. She had a drastic haircut, but it looked great on her. Hans was with her, telling her how beautiful she was. They were at the Patman's house, dancing in the ballroom, but the other guests didn't seem to be around. Suddenly, Leela Fowler appeared from nowhere, wearing an elf suit. She handed Jessica a silver crown. "You won, fair and square," Leela told her. Jessica was just about to accept the crown from Leela and turn into Miss Christmas Time when a horrible trickle of cold water began running down her back. "Stop it," she told Leela, who didn't seem to understand. The cold water became more insistent. "Cut it out," Jessica moaned, opening one eye. Stephen was leaning over her, dripping water on her neck. "Wake up, Sleeping Beauty," he sang. "It's time for you and me to make something wonderful for dinner tonight." Jessica sat up, frowning. "I was dreaming," she said crossly. "All the same," Stephen said cheerfully, "it's almost 5 o'clock, and we have to think of something fabulous to make. Come on, my culinary partner," he crooned, grabbing her hand and pulling her to her feet. "Our pantry awaits you." "Why can't Suzanne help you?" Jessica yawned. "I thought you two were on such good terms." Stephen laughed. "Just because I'm not trying to bite her head off every time she talks? Anyway, she's taking a nap." "What do you think I was doing?" Jessica said, outraged. "Another nap?" she asked a second later. "What is it with these sophisticated city girls? She's barely been awake since she got here." "I know," Stephen said thoughtfully, shutting the glass door to the patio behind them as they went inside. "I'm sort of worried about her, actually." "You're so gullible, Steve," Jessica complained. "You're much too nice for your own good. Can't you tell Suzanne's trying to fake us all out?" "I'm not so sure. She got really dizzy when she was going upstairs, and if I hadn't caught her, she might have fallen and hurt herself. I think something's going on." "You've been watching too many soap operas," Jessica said dismissively, padding into the kitchen. "Honestly, Steve, listen to your sister for once. That girl is poison. I'm convinced of it." "Look," Stephen said, "the world would end if you and Liz and I didn't have a major disagreement every once in a while. And this may be it." "I think Susie's okay. She was obviously terrible before, but she's admitted as much. Now she wants you to forgive her and give her a second chance." "Ha!" Jessica snorted. She wanted to tell Stephen about Suzanne and Todd, but it was obvious that he was on Suzanne's side. He wouldn't listen to anything negative about her. So, if Steve wanted to be such a nice guy, she'd just have to let him. But she couldn't wait to see his face when he discovered what Suzanne was really like. Luckily, Jessica had Aaron and Winston on her side. Suzanne said she wanted a secret Santa, Jessica thought, opening the refrigerator. And now she had two. Jessica was sure they'd bring her all sorts of surprises. The kinds of surprises that would make her incredibly homesick for New York. The kind, Jessica thought to herself, that would make her wish she had never set foot in Sweet Valley. Chapter 10. It was 12:30 on Tuesday afternoon, and Elizabeth was famished. She had spent the whole morning at the Valley Mall with Jessica, and by lunchtime she was too tired and too poor to last much longer. Jessica had bought a bag of jelly beans, an oversized chocolate chip cookie, and a pocket mirror to leave for Bruce Patman. Then she'd run into Kara in front of Kitchens and Cookery and decided to help her choose something for her mother. "Go on home," Jessica had told Elizabeth. "Kara will take me back later on." So Elizabeth had driven home alone. As she pulled into the driveway, she noticed that the mail had arrived. So, instead of going in the back way, she walked across the lawn, removed the mail from the box, then unlocked the front door. "Phew," Elizabeth said, setting the Wakefield's mail down on the hall table along with her shopping bags. She'd done pretty well, actually. She found a record in discount discs that she knew Stephen really wanted, and she'd managed to get away from Jessica long enough to buy her the scented body cream she'd been hinting about. A few silly gifts for Aaron Dallas had rounded off the list. "That still leaves Todd," Elizabeth reminded herself, rifling absently through the mail. There was nothing for her, but there was something for Suzanne. A big, red envelope. It didn't have a stamp on it, so Elizabeth figured that someone must have left it in the mailbox. Probably a Christmas card from someone, Elizabeth thought, leaving all the mail in a pile and putting Suzanne's letter on top where she would see it. It had felt a little strange seeing Todd again, she thought, as she carried the shopping bags up to her bedroom. They had gone to the Egberts' house after that strange scene with Suzanne. The latest in a series of scenes that were beginning to make Elizabeth worry about the girl. In fact, they'd talked about Suzanne all the way over to Winston's. Todd couldn't understand her behavior either, and he looked puzzled when Elizabeth told him that Jessica thought she was taking drugs. "That doesn't seem very likely," he'd objected. "Maybe what Jessica saw was vitamins or something." In the end, they both started laughing, remembering what a disaster Suzanne's last visit had been. By that time, they were at Winston's house, and any chance to have a real talk was out of the question. They really hadn't been alone for more than a minute. Elizabeth thought she was imagining it at first, but she had a feeling that Todd was trying to avoid being alone with her, as if there was something he didn't want to face. To begin with, he dragged her over to the Egberts. Next, he suggested they go back to Ken's house. And the atmosphere there had been a little peculiar. That wasn't Todd's fault, Elizabeth reminded herself. Ken's house was filled with relatives, including his little cousins, who were jumping on Todd's or Elizabeth's lap and begging them to give piggyback rides. It had hardly been a romantic scene. Still, Todd was a guest in Ken's home, and he said he felt he had to spend at least part of his first day relaxing with the family. Elizabeth had given up at about 4 o'clock, realizing they wouldn't get a chance to be alone together. "Tonight," Todd had promised her, "we're going to escape this madhouse and sneak off together. Just the two of us, okay?" Okay? Elizabeth couldn't believe her ears. It was what she'd been waiting for. Finally, they would have an opportunity to be by themselves so the magic between them could be rekindled. What Todd had forgotten, though, Elizabeth thought, was the loyal affection of his old classmates. They weren't going to let his first night in town go unnoticed. "Ken asked us to meet him at the beach disco at 9 o'clock, Todd told her when he picked her up. I know, he apologized, seeing the look on her face. "But he said he just wanted to buy me a soda. We'll take off after half an hour, I promise." Elizabeth sighed. It wasn't Todd's fault that he was so popular. He couldn't help it that Ken had organized a surprise welcome home party at the disco that would last until almost 2 in the morning. And Elizabeth had to admit she'd had a good time. The Droids, Sweet Valley High's own rock band, had even written a song for Todd and Elizabeth. They played it for the first big dance number. It was called I'll wait for you. And at least Elizabeth got to dance with Todd, because that was the last time she saw him all night. Every time she managed to get near him, someone pounced on him, wanting to know all about Vermont. Kind of tough having to share your romantic reunion with 60 other people, Jessica sympathized, breaking away from Hans long enough to join her sister on a bench at the edge of the crowded dance floor. Elizabeth smiled. I should have guessed Ken would do something like this, she said. I was looking forward to an evening alone with Todd, but I'm glad he's having a chance to catch up with all his friends. At last the party had broken up, and she and Todd had had some time alone together, or almost alone. Liz, I hate to do this to you guys, Jessica said nervously, edging closer to her sister as the party was thinning out, but it looks like Hans can't give me a ride home, so do you think... Elizabeth sighed. Sure, Jess. Todd looked exhausted anyway, and she was so tired herself she could barely keep her head up. So they'd given Jessica a ride home, and their evening had ended with a hasty kiss on the Wakefields' front porch. Oh well, Elizabeth thought, taking out the Christmas presents she'd bought and wondering what to do about wrapping paper this year. There's always tonight. Todd was supposed to come over so he could spend a little time with Mr. and Mrs. Wakefield, who wanted to see him. Elizabeth and Todd had nothing planned, just a little TV, maybe a long walk, and some peace and quiet, Elizabeth thought. A chance to see where we really stand. So far, she hadn't felt anything even close to the old magic with Todd, but they hadn't had a chance, she reminded herself. She was sure the minute they got a few minutes alone together, it would be just the way it once was, and this nagging little worry she'd been feeling for weeks would disappear. Suzanne, what is it? You look awful, Elizabeth blurted out. She had gone downstairs to fix herself lunch, but the look on Suzanne's face made her forget everything. Suzanne was holding the red envelope addressed to her in one hand, her face white as a sheet. Suzanne, Elizabeth repeated, what is it? But she might as well have been talking to a ghost. Suzanne was just staring at the sheet of paper in her other hand, her lower lip trembling and her face ashen. Liz, she said finally, her voice quavering, look. Elizabeth hurried over and scanned the piece of paper the girl had thrust out in her shaking hand. At once she could see why Suzanne was so upset. Someone had cut individual letters out of the newspaper, gluing them onto a piece of paper to look like a ransom note. Susie Devlin, go home, the note said, from your secret Santas. I feel sick, Suzanne whispered, rubbing her temple and pushing the piece of paper away. Oh, Liz, how could anyone do such a rotten thing? Elizabeth's heart went out to the girl. Come into the living room and sit down, she said gently. I'm going to make us both a pot of tea, and we can have that talk you mentioned yesterday. How would that be? Tears welled in Suzanne's eyes. I knew it was going to be hard, she whispered. In fact, I thought maybe I was crazy to come back here, but I wanted to try. I wanted so badly to try. A few minutes later, Elizabeth had helped Suzanne to a cup of tea. The color was coming back to her face, and Elizabeth couldn't help being glad she'd been around to comfort the girl when she'd opened the letter. Suzanne had caused a lot of trouble the last time she was in Sweet Valley, Elizabeth thought, but that didn't justify this kind of cruelty. You see, I'm really serious, Suzanne told her sincerely, pushing her dark hair back with a slim hand as she lifted the cup to her lips. I feel awful about what happened when I was out here before. I told you yesterday I don't have an explanation for it. I was going through a very difficult time with Pete, with my parents, especially with my parents. Suzanne grimaced as she set down her cup. Liz, you wouldn't believe how jealous I was of you when I stayed here before. Jealous? Of me? Elizabeth laughed. Suzanne, how in the world could you? I'm serious, Suzanne said quietly. You see, I've always wanted to have a home like you guys do. Sure, my parents have money. Tons of it, she laughed bitterly. But time? Never. I got used to being lonely, or so I thought. But inside I always wanted this, she said, gesturing around her. A comfortable home,
parents who adore me, who want to be with me, a father who's more than just a signature on a check. She bit her lip. Pete was bad news, too. My mom was crazy about him because he had all the right credentials, if you know what I mean. His parents knew my parents. He had an expensive car and a lot of money, but he didn't care that much about me. Not the real me, anyway. Elizabeth was listening quietly, not saying a word. Something in Suzanne's expression told her that the girl wasn't lying. This time, Suzanne was telling her the truth. Well, Suzanne said, staring down at her hands, I just kind of flipped out when I came here before, I think. I didn't want to come, you know. My parents told me less than a week before I came that they'd arranged it. I never was given a choice. That's awful, Elizabeth burst out. I never knew that. Suzanne shrugged. That's the way my parents operate, she said softly. Used to operate, she corrected herself. A year ago, they would never have heard of my not going with them to St. Moritz. But when I found out what? Elizabeth asked. Suzanne's face paled. Nothing, she said quickly, reaching for her mug again. Something in her eyes told Elizabeth not to press her. She looked scared, Elizabeth thought, scared and alone. Elizabeth wished there was some way she could reassure her, some way she could let her know that her secret, whatever it was safe with her. What I meant to say, Suzanne added swiftly, is that we've gotten more honest with each other lately. I'm able to tell them how I feel, and they're much more willing to listen. So when I told them I wanted to come back here, they agreed. Elizabeth didn't know what to say. Suzanne, she began awkwardly, I'm very sorry someone was stupid enough and mean enough to leave you that note. But you mustn't let it get to you if you really want to stay. It's one thing to make me understand, and I think I'm beginning to. But some of the other kids, maybe... Liz, do you think I can do it? Suzanne asked painfully. Do you think if I really try I can make it up to some of them? I don't know, Elizabeth sighed, but I admire you for trying. And who knows? I'm going to try even harder, Suzanne said firmly. Who cares about that stupid note? You know what I'm going to do as soon as I've made you a wonderful lunch? What? Elizabeth asked, taken aback by Suzanne's enthusiasm. I'm going to call Aaron Dallas and see if he'll let me take him out for lunch tomorrow, Suzanne said happily. That seems like a good place to start, don't you think? Sure, Elizabeth said, smiling at her. She didn't add that she doubted Aaron would agree to go. The poor girl had been through a hard enough time already. She would have to call Aaron Dallas and find out how angry he still was for herself. Hi, Jessica called, putting down her shopping bags in the front hall. When no one answered, she walked through the house, opened the sliding door, and went out onto the patio. Sure enough, Elizabeth was by the pool, reading. How can you even bear to look at a book that size when we're on vacation? Jessica demanded, dropping down on the grass next to her sister. Elizabeth hurried to the end of the paragraph. I happen to like reading, she said. Did you buy me something spectacular for Christmas? I bought you something, Jessica laughed. Where's the devil? Taking a nap, Elizabeth said, rolling her eyes at her sister's nickname for Suzanne. You know, it's kind of weird, Jess. I think she must be on some kind of medication that's making her sleepy. Drugs, Jessica said. I told you so. How come you never listened to me? Not that kind of drugs, Elizabeth said. I think she may be sick, Jess. Really sick. She seems to get dizzy spells. And when she was watching TV earlier, she wasn't even looking at the set. I heard her tell Mom that she's having problems with her vision. Listen, Florence Nightingale, Jessica said, forget Suzanne's drug addiction side effects and tell me how things are with Todd. Elizabeth laughed. Well, wait a minute, Jessica interrupted. I think that's the phone. I'll get it, Elizabeth said hastily, scrambling to her feet. That's probably Todd now. Is Suzanne there? A deep voice asked when Elizabeth answered the phone. No, Elizabeth said, trying to get her breath. I mean, she is, but I'm afraid she's sleeping right now. Can I take a message for her? This is Aaron Dallas. Who am I speaking to? Is this Jess? Liz, Elizabeth told him. What's up, Aaron? I don't know. That's why I called you. I just got back to the house, and my sister said Suzanne left me a message to call her.
Elizabeth remembered now that Suzanne had tried to call Erin after lunch. Why don't you try again in a couple of hours, she suggested. I know she wanted to talk to you.
Fine, Erin said.
Changing the subject, he asked Elizabeth if she'd had fun the previous night. After several minutes chatting with him, Elizabeth said goodbye and replaced the receiver on the hook. Well, Jessica demanded when she came outside again. Well, what? Elizabeth murmured, picking her book up and trying to find her place. Was that Todd? Elizabeth shook her head. No, it wasn't, she said. Liz, Jessica wailed. You know I don't hold up well under torture. Who was it? Aaron, Elizabeth replied calmly. Aaron, Jessica gasped. Well, why didn't you call me? He didn't ask for you, Elizabeth said, turning another page and running her eyes over the words. He asked for Suzanne. Suzanne? Jessica looked as if she just swallowed something terrible. What for? Did he say? Jessica, Elizabeth set her book down in her lap. For your information, I am not a switchboard operator or an answering machine. Jessica looked hurt. Oh, all right, Elizabeth conceded. I give in. He was calling back because Suzanne had called him earlier. She wants to take him out to lunch. She wants... Jessica gave a short laugh. Why? Is she going to poison him? As a matter of fact, she wants to try to make up to Aaron after being so rotten to him the last time. And I think she really means well, Jess. Jessica's mind was racing. Yeah, I'll bet she does. Has Patsy heard about their little lunch date? Jess, they haven't made a lunch date, and it wouldn't be a date either, Elizabeth corrected her. Suzanne just wants to be friends. Oh, Liz, you're so gullible. Suzanne doesn't want anything of the sort. She's obviously trying to go after Aaron now that he's happily in love with Patsy. That would be just like her, wouldn't it? You're wrong, Elizabeth said shortly. That isn't what she wants at all. Quit jumping to conclusions, Jess, and give the girl a chance. Jessica stared in disbelief at her twin. If she didn't love Elizabeth so much, she'd tell her what she'd overheard between Todd and Suzanne the previous day. Maybe that would alert her sister to the fact that Suzanne was trying to steal every guy she could. But knowing Liz, Jessica thought, she'd probably laugh the whole thing off and say what I heard was nothing. That would be just like her. She'd tell me I'm making too much out of it. Well, Jessica had it. She was sick of watching Suzanne's deceitful tricks being misunderstood by her entire family. Obviously, it was up to Jessica to protect them all, since they couldn't protect themselves. And Aaron? Jumping at the bait the minute it was offered. No, it was clear to Jessica that she was going to have to do some planning of her own if she really wanted Suzanne out of the picture by Christmas Day. If she could get Aaron to help her and not wimp out as her own family had, it looked as if they'd have Suzanne exactly where they wanted her by Friday night. And exactly where we want her, Jessica thought, with a mean little smile, is anywhere but Sweet Valley. And this time she won't come back. Chapter 11. Aaron, it's me, Jess, Jessica said 20 minutes later. She was in the study with the door closed so no one could hear her.
Hi, Jess. What's up?
I'm calling about Suzanne, Jessica said pointedly. Listen, Aaron, this is really getting out of hand. I mean, the girl is a complete lunatic.
What's she done now? I thought she was taking a nap.
Liz said. She is taking a nap, Jessica told him. That isn't the bad part. She called you earlier today, right?
Yeah, that's why I called back, Aaron said patiently. To see what...
Well, listen, Jessica said impatiently. Do you know why she called?
Aaron laughed. If I knew why she called, why would I have bothered to call back? What is this, Jess? A cross-examination?
Aaron, Jessica hissed. She's trying to seduce you. Aaron was quiet for a moment. Then he said,
Jess, is this your idea of some kind of joke?
I'm dead serious, Jessica assured him. Listen, Liz told me all about it, though she made me swear not to tell anyone. I guess Suzanne got all buddy-buddy with her this morning, and Liz pretended to go along with her so she could sort of find out what's happening, you know?
Yeah, Aaron said, sounding baffled. I'm with you.
Anyway, Suzanne told Liz that she wanted to take you out to lunch. Someplace sort of off the beaten track, you know? She said she wanted to get to know you better, if you see what I mean.
Wow, Aaron said breathily. And you really think she wanted?
I'm positive, Jessica said. Believe me, Aaron, this is getting serious. We've got to do something before Patsy finds out and gets jealous. Jessica thought that little addition at the end was a stroke of genius. Patsy Weber was notorious for being jealous where Aaron was concerned. The slightest thing got her all worked up, and if she found out Suzanne was after Aaron, he could count on weeks of quarreling.
Okay, Aaron said. What do we do?
Jessica took a deep breath. I've got a plan, she told him. Do you want to hear it?
Aaron sighed. Shoot.
First of all, call Suzanne back and act really friendly. Tell her you'd love to spend some time with her, but you're too busy this week to make lunch. Okay so far?
I guess so, Aaron said glumly.
Good, Jessica went on. Now, the next step is to set up Friday night. Suzanne's planning on going to the Christmas dance at Bruce's, but you've got to convince her that it's going to be terribly crowded and it'd be much more fun to go to a pre-party first. Can you make up someone who might have won? Someone from college?
I guess so. My cousin Eddie, Aaron told her.
Fine. So Eddie's having a pre-party and you want her to come. The problem is you can't pick her up, but don't tell her that now or she'll suspect something. Wait till Friday, about half an hour before the party's supposed to start, say around 7:30. Then call her up and say you have a flat tire. You can't pick her up, but you've got the address with you, and can she meet you over there instead?
Then what? Aaron asked. Where's she going to go? My cousin Eddie is married. He doesn't want her driving over there, and I promised Patsy.
Jessica sighed. Aaron, listen to me. Give her a fake address. Give her the address of the old house on Forest Lane, she giggled. That's perfect. Jessica was referring to an old, dilapidated house on Forest Lane, a lonely wooded street on the outskirts of Sweet Valley. Everyone knew about the old house because some of the Wilder kids used to have parties there before the police found out about it. Gradually, it had gotten the reputation of being haunted.
Wait a minute, Aaron interrupted. So I tell her to meet me at this great party on Forest Lane. Then what do I do?
Nothing, Jessica explained. Just go to Bruce's with Patsy the way you planned. Suzanne will figure it out pretty quickly, she added. She's not that dense. She'll drive all the way out to this place, find it's just some old deserted house, and go back to Bruce's just like she planned from the beginning. Only, Jessica added, she'll realize what a jerk she was to believe you really wanted to spend time with her.
I don't know, Jess, Aaron said unhappily. It sounds kind of far out. What if she turns down the idea of going at all? Or what if...
You can handle her, Jessica said. Come on, Aaron, she's practically your slave. She'd die for the chance to get you alone.
That's another thing, Aaron pointed out. The neighborhood up around Forest Lawn is awfully deserted, Jess. What if something happened to her? She could get hurt or something, and I'd...
Aaron, Jessica said patiently, nothing is going to happen to her. She's simply going to turn around and drive back to Bruce's. Well, Aaron hesitated. Listen, Jessica said, if you don't want to help me, Aaron, it's up to you. I mean, it's you I was really thinking of. You and Patsy, I mean. You know Suzanne as well as I do, and if you aren't worried that... Aaron sighed.
Okay, I'll call her.
Aaron, Jessica said happily, I knew I could count on you.
I just hope nothing bad happens to her, because if...
Aaron, Jessica said sweetly, don't you worry about a thing. The only bad thing that's going to happen to Suzanne is that she's going to get a little of her own back. She's going to realize she can't just stomp back in here and do whatever she pleases.
Hear, hear, Aaron laughed. Jessica, you should go into politics. You're really good at getting people on your side, you know that?
What a wonderful way to put it, Jessica thought. Aaron Dallas was smarter than she'd realized. Oh, Aaron, she added suddenly, a thought occurring to her. When you talk to Suzanne, tell her not to mention anything to Liz, okay?
Why? Aaron asked.
Oh, you know, Jessica said vaguely. Liz is funny about things like this. Just tell Suzanne that Liz wasn't invited to Eddie's and you're trying to keep it a secret so you won't hurt anyone. That should do the trick.
Sure, Aaron said. Whatever you say, Jess.
Jessica breathed a small sigh of relief. It was a good thing she had thought of that, she told herself. She didn't want her twin messing up the most perfect revenge scheme in the world. Aaron Dallas's phone call, Suzanne reflected, as she sat in Jessica's room, was the first good thing that had happened to her since she'd arrived at the Wakefields. Aaron had actually sounded pleased when she told him she wanted to take him out for lunch.
"The thing is, there's no way I can make it this week," he had said regretfully.
And he'd meant it, she was sure. He wasn't just making excuses. He really wanted to spend some time with her. So Suzanne had jumped at the chance when Aaron suggested an alternative.
"You're going to the Christmas dance at Bruce Patman's on Friday night, aren't you?" he'd asked her.
Yes, Suzanne told him. I'd planned to, anyway. Oh, why?
"My cousin Eddie is having a cocktail party from 8 till 10 on Friday. It's going to be a really small thing, just Eddie, his wife, and some of their friends from work. But I thought it might be nice if you wanted to come with me for a little while. Then we could head over to Bruce's. I don't think we'd miss much."
"I'd love that," Suzanne had exclaimed. It was hard to keep the excitement out of her voice. A genuine invitation. Suzanne felt as if she'd won a major battle.
"I'll pick you up about 7:30 then, okay?" Aaron had asked.
"That's great," Suzanne told him, tears of happiness in her eyes. "Perfect.
"Oh, and Suzanne, don't mention this to Jessica or Liz, okay? It's such a small party I can't invite them to, and I don't want to hurt their feelings."
"Of course not," Suzanne said warmly. "Well, that's great, Aaron. I'll see you Friday night." Suzanne wasn't interested in Aaron romantically. He was simply a nice guy, someone she'd been cruel to the last time she was in Sweet Valley. She had heard he was going out with Patsy Weber, and she certainly didn't want to get in the way. All Suzanne cared about was that her suggestion had been met with kindness and enthusiasm. If she'd invited him to lunch, and he turned her down and sounded as chilly and unwelcoming as most people had so far, well, she probably would have given up. She would have called her parents and asked them if she could meet them in St. Moritz. It had been a rough week. The one person who had surprised her the most was Todd Wilkins. After their meeting in Killington, she would have expected him to be a lot friendlier. She'd had fun with him that weekend. The day they had taken that walk together, she'd realized he was a wonderful person. So considerate, so mature for his age, and she had felt as though they had parted as friends that day. Admittedly, it had been a surprise to see him in Sweet Valley, but it was a pleasant surprise, and Suzanne had felt optimistic about the thought of having an ally the next week or two. Instead, Todd had been particularly awkward around her since his warning not to tell Elizabeth about Killington. He barely looked at her when they were in the same room. When she asked him anything, he answered in clipped monosyllables. He seemed to want to keep his distance from her. Suzanne shivered. It felt cold to her in Jessica's room, even though she had a sweater on and a blanket around her. Dr. Franklin had warned her about that. He said the medication couldn't help that. The blurring of her vision, maybe, and the terrible dizzy spell she'd been getting more and more frequently, but the chills wouldn't go away, no matter how many pills she took. And neither would the fear. No medicine in the world could help that, Suzanne sighed. Sometimes she wondered if she was doing the right thing keeping this a secret. Shouldn't she just tell them all? But she'd promised herself she wouldn't. "I know it doesn't make sense," she told Mr. and Mrs. Wakefield, "but I want to win this battle on my own. I don't want anyone to pity me. If they knew, if the other kids knew—" She had shaken her head, her eyes filled with tears. She'd had enough pity from her friends in New York. Out here, Suzanne had decided to fight this thing the hard way, and she was going to keep her secret, she told herself, no matter what. The twins were sitting in the living room with Todd and Suzanne, watching Mr. Wakefield adjusting the knobs on the television set. "I made some popcorn," Mrs. Wakefield said, bringing in a bowl and passing it around. "Todd," she smiled, "I can't tell you how good it is to see you here again." But Elizabeth barely heard Todd's response. She couldn't keep this up, she was thinking. Something was definitely wrong. And she thought she should say something to Todd about it. She didn't know whether it was her imagination, but he seemed so tense, so wound up. The way he was treating Suzanne, for example, it was embarrassing. He barely even said hello to her when he'd come into the house. And every time she spoke to him, he just mumbled in response. It was one thing to remember that the girl was a pain before, she thought, but he was acting weird around her. The very least he could do was to be polite. Elizabeth told herself things would ease up once the movie was on, but Todd continued to act strangely whenever Suzanne so much as looked in his direction. "Am I in your way?" Suzanne asked from her position on the floor in front of the TV.
"What do you mean?" Todd asked, staring at her.
"Todd," Elizabeth said, poking him in the side. She couldn't tell whether he was trying to embarrass Suzanne or just wasn't paying attention. He seemed 1,000 miles away. Once, when Suzanne asked him a direct question, he didn't answer. Another time, when she was minding her own business, he asked her to turn the volume up on the TV set and looked upset when she turned it down by mistake. Elizabeth couldn't stand it any more. "Todd, let's take a walk," she whispered. Todd was on his feet in a second.
"Good idea," he said. He looked as though he wanted to be anywhere but right there.
"What's going on?" Elizabeth asked him mildly when they were outside.
Todd looked surprised. "What are you talking about?"
"I mean with you and Suzanne."
Todd stared at her. "What?"
"You're acting so weird around her," Elizabeth said impatiently. "I mean, it isn't as though you have to punish her single-handedly for what happened the last time she was here. She's been getting a hard enough time as it is. Jessica's driving her crazy."
"I didn't do anything," Todd muttered. "You're just overly sensitive, Liz. In fact," he added, "you're the one who's acting weird, if you ask me. You keep staring at me all the time with a critical look on your face."
"I do not," Elizabeth said angrily.
"Liz," Todd said, grabbing her shoulders and turning her to face him. "What's happening? We haven't seen each other in months, and now we're arguing."
Elizabeth dropped her gaze. "It's pretty silly, isn't it?"
"Do you know," Todd told her, "how many nights I've dreamed of walking this way with you, of listening to the crickets, looking at the street lights, and putting my arm around your shoulder?"
A lump formed in Elizabeth's throat. "I've dreamed about it too," she admitted. "But it isn't the way I dreamed it would be," she thought unhappily. "Something doesn't seem right between us. I don't know what it is, but the magic isn't here anymore." "Todd, I'm so sorry," she began awkwardly. "I didn't mean to start an argument. I just felt so distant from you, so confused."
"I know," Todd said huskily. "Liz."
"What?" Elizabeth asked, searching his face for a clue to what he was feeling.
"Let's never argue again, okay?"
Elizabeth took a deep, quavering breath as Todd put his arm around her. "Okay," she said finally, but there wasn't much conviction in her voice. It wasn't until much later, when Elizabeth was tiptoeing across her bedroom, trying not to wake Jessica, that she realized Todd had never apologized for the way he was treating Suzanne. In fact, Elizabeth thought with a start, he hadn't said anything about it at all. That wasn't like Todd. Not like the old Todd, anyway. Elizabeth was beginning to wonder if she hadn't been rash, promising never to argue with the new Todd again. Because the new Todd, she thought uneasily, never told her why he was being so strange around Suzanne, and the old Todd never would have acted that way at all, even if he'd been provoked. The old Todd, Elizabeth sighed. But where was the old Todd, and what could she do to bring him back? Chapter 12. It was Wednesday morning, and Jessica, Elizabeth, and Suzanne were on their way back from the grocery store. "What do you usually have for Christmas dinner, Susie?" Elizabeth asked her, rummaging in the brown paper bags on the floor of the car to make sure they hadn't forgotten any of the things Mrs. Wakefield had asked them to get. "We don't really have Christmas dinner," Suzanne said thoughtfully. "You see, for about 10 years now, the tradition in our family has been to go on a vacation together for the week between Christmas and New Year's. It's nice," she added, "but it's even nicer being in a real home for the holiday." Jessica sniffed. "I wouldn't mind spending a Christmas vacation in St. Moritz," she remarked. Suzanne laughed. "Yeah, St. Moritz is great. The strangest vacations were the ones we took when I was little. We used to go somewhere hot, like Aruba or somewhere in Mexico. It was terrible. Can you imagine having piped-in Christmas carols playing while you're putting suntan lotion on in some resort somewhere?" Jessica eyed her coldly in the rearview mirror. "Some of us," she said pointedly, "have always had warm Christmases. Isn't that right, Liz?" Suzanne turned bright red.
Wow, I'm really tactful today, she muttered, hitting herself on the forehead. Elizabeth grinned at her. Almost in spite of herself, she was beginning to like Suzanne. Once the girl relaxed, she had an excellent sense of humor and a natural vivacity that were appealing. Don't worry about Jess, she told Suzanne. She's pretty thick-skinned, aren't you, Jess? Hey, Suzanne said suddenly, do you think we could stop at the post office on the way home? I just remembered I've got a package from New York arriving there this morning. Jessica swore under her breath, signaling as she moved into the left lane. Now you tell me, she muttered. Jess, Elizabeth reproached her, we're only about a block away from the post office. A block in the wrong direction, Jessica pointed out, taking a right-hand turn so she could drive around the block. Sorry, Suzanne said. I wish I'd thought of it earlier. I could have taken the car myself so you wouldn't have to go out of your way, though I'm not much of a driver, she admitted. In New York City, you can't get your license until you're 18, but I got mine. She stopped herself. She had almost said in Vermont, then realized that if she mentioned Vermont, Elizabeth might make some connection between her and Todd. Out of state, she concluded vaguely, but I haven't driven much. It's one of Jessica's greatest talents, Elizabeth teased. Don't you think she'd make a great chauffeur? Jessica slammed on the brakes, scowling. The post office, madame, she announced. Back in a flash, Suzanne promised, jumping out of the car and hurrying into the tiny building. What's with the special delivery stuff, I wonder, Jessica said impatiently. This girl is so much trouble. Actually, I think she's okay, Elizabeth said lightly. Don't you think you're being awfully hard on her? What about Mr. Collins, Jessica said. What about the way she used you before? And Mom and Dad? Elizabeth was quiet for a minute. I really think she's changed, Jess, she said finally. Jessica shook her head. Sometimes I just don't believe you. I don't understand how you can forget everything she did. A few minutes later, Suzanne came out of the post office, a tiny brown envelope in her hand. That's the smallest package I ever saw, Jessica commented. What's inside? Jewelry? Suzanne didn't say anything, but Elizabeth thought her face looked almost pained as she struggled to control herself. Nothing much, she said lightly, slipping the package into her blazer pocket. Her hand, Elizabeth noticed, was trembling violently. Suzanne went right upstairs when they got home. Leaving us to put the groceries away, Jessica commented. Another piece of mail from Suzanne's evil Secret Santa had been waiting for her in the mailbox, and a big gift-wrapped box with Susie tagged on it was on the front porch. Only there was nothing inside. Suzanne was obviously upset and made some excuse to go upstairs. Jess, I want to talk to you, Elizabeth said quietly. I'm all ears, Jessica said sweetly. Now, I've got to be fast because Suzanne's going to come down any second. But, Jess, I've been watching her very carefully, and I'm convinced there's something really wrong with her. I don't know what it is, but it all adds up. The fact that Mom and Dad let her come back here but wouldn't give us a good reason for it, the amount of rest she's been getting, and she's so frail looking, plus all the pills. It's an act, Liz. I'm serious, Elizabeth said, almost desperately. Jess, believe me, I know what I'm talking about. Promise me you'll soften up on her. I'm really frightened. Jessica stared at her sister. Elizabeth really did sound frightened. Was it possible she'd been wrong about Suzanne? Maybe the girl really did have something wrong with her. Okay, Jessica said seriously. I'll lay off, Liz. If you really think there's something genuinely wrong with her. I don't just think so, Elizabeth told her. I'm convinced of it. She folded up the empty brown paper bags and stashed them under the sink. Now, I'm supposed to meet Enid at the mall. After I help put these away, she added, looking with dismay at the groceries spread all over the counter. Will you make sure Suzanne's all right while I'm gone? Sure, Jessica said, a guilty flush spreading across her face. I promise, Liz.
I guess I better do some scheming in reverse, she thought. Because if Liz is right, if Suzanne came out here because she's sick and wants to make up with us all before she collapses or something, oh God, Jessica thought, if that's really true, I'd better call Aaron as fast as I can and tell him and Winston to stop the nasty Santa routine. And I'd better tell Aaron to forget all about the fake party Friday night out on Forest Lane. After Elizabeth left, Jessica went into the den to start wrapping Christmas presents. She was trying to decide how to wrap the bag of jelly beans she'd gotten Bruce when the phone rang. She picked up on the third ring, and Suzanne answered at the same time upstairs. "Is Liz there?" Jessica heard a familiar voice inquire. It was Todd. Frozen, Jessica held the receiver to her ear, but said nothing. I should hang up, she was thinking. Suzanne may have some terrible disease, and it's none of my business what she says to Todd. She's gone out shopping, Suzanne said, and paused for a minute. Is this Todd? Jessica heard her ask. Susie? Todd demanded. Yeah, it's Todd. He sighed. I'm glad I got you alone, he added after a minute. I'll bet, Jessica thought, beginning to fume again. I'll just bet. Look, I'm really sorry I've been such a pain, he said awkwardly. I mean, I know I've been really strange around you, but I guess I have to admit I've been sort of surprised, Suzanne told him. I mean, after that day in Killington. Jessica completely forgot all thoughts of disease and compassion. What day in Killington? Elizabeth didn't know about this. Something was definitely going on here. I know, Todd said huskily. Susie, I know. When I asked you not to tell Liz about all that, I guess I didn't realize. I don't know. I just feel strange. I should have told her right from the start. Todd, Suzanne said gently, don't blame yourself. You couldn't help what happened in Vermont. After all, she pointed out, I was the one who asked you to come back to the lodge. I know, Todd said miserably. I know. Look, Suzanne went on, it would be silly to bring any of that up at this point. Anyway, she added, Liz would understand. Don't bet on that, Jessica fumed. She couldn't believe her ears. Todd had gone back to the lodge with Suzanne. This was much worse than she'd feared. Much, much worse. Well, I don't want to keep you on the phone, Todd said. Maybe we can talk later. I'm sorry I've been such a jerk around you, and I promise to try. Todd, Suzanne interrupted, sounding positively silky. That afternoon we spent together was one of the best times I've had in years, but I never wanted to make things hard for you. Honestly. You haven't, Susie, Todd sighed. I'll see you later on, okay? Jessica listened to their goodbyes in a state of shock. She couldn't believe it. Her darkest fears had been right after all. Suzanne hadn't come out to Sweet Valley because she was sick, nor had she come out to make up with anybody. She'd come because Todd was coming. That afternoon with him, that little tryst at the lodge, had been special enough for Suzanne to forget about St. Moritz and come racing out to the west coast. Jessica was practically shaking with rage. Suzanne had done it again. She had deceived them all, pretending to be so frail and so broken-hearted about her wrongdoings, when all the while she was just waiting for Todd and flirting with him right in front of poor Elizabeth's eyes. Jessica vowed to put a stop to it. She was not going to tell Aaron Dallas to leave Suzanne alone. If Suzanne thought she could steal Todd away from Elizabeth, she'd forgotten to count in Elizabeth's twin sister. Because I'm no sucker, Jessica raged. She can't make me believe whatever she wants me to. I know the truth, and I'm going to make sure she gets exactly what she deserves. In the end, Elizabeth decided to buy Todd a scarf. He'll need it all the way up in those freezing cold mountains, she told Enid. The two girls had stopped by Casey's place for a cold drink before heading home. As always, Elizabeth felt immensely cheered, sitting across the table from her dearest friend. One look at you, and my problems don't seem so insurmountable, Elizabeth told her warmly. Enid giggled. Thanks. Does that mean you look at me and think, God, I could look like her? Elizabeth laughed. Not exactly. You're just a good shoulder to cry on. Why the tears? Isn't everything perfect now that Todd's back in town? Elizabeth sighed. Enid, she said slowly, this is kind of hard for me to admit, but I think some of the spark between Todd and me just isn't there anymore. Enid stared at her, her green eyes wide. You're kidding, she whispered. Elizabeth shook her head. It's strange. I mean, we're still very close, but it's a different kind of closeness. Don't get me wrong, she added quickly. I still think he's incredibly cute and everything, but most of the time, I don't know. It just doesn't feel right. Something's missing, she concluded helplessly. The waitress came over with their drinks, and Enid thanked her politely. Have you two talked about it yet? She asked as she unwrapped her straw. Elizabeth pulled her root beer closer to her. Not yet, she admitted. It's kind of hard with all the chaos around our house. But I know we have to talk, and soon. It sure sounds that way, Enid said, shaking her head. Boy, it's kind of hard to imagine you and Todd having problems. You always seem like the dream couple to me. Elizabeth sighed. Well, I think in many ways we were unusually lucky. Everything always went our way, you know. But this move has been a big thing. It's made an enormous difference. Has he ever talked about other girls? Enid asked. Elizabeth looked taken aback. No, she said. It's funny, but I still have a hard time imagining that, though I guess it's just because I don't want to be able to imagine it. I'm sure he must have met girls he's attracted to, girls he would like to date. He wouldn't be normal otherwise. How would you feel, Enid persisted, if he told you that he met someone else, that he wanted to call things off because of another girl? Elizabeth thought very hard for a moment. Enid, Elizabeth said carefully, weighing her words, I'm not sure that Todd and I are going to be a twosome much longer, and if that's the case, as I'm afraid it is, I'd be delighted if he met another girl. Enid shook her head. Wow, she said. You're really serious about this, huh? Elizabeth nodded. I'll never forget Todd, she said softly, balling up the wrapper of her straw, but I can't help feeling it's over now. Really over. And if that's the way it is, I guess I want Todd to make his peace with it too. I want it to be mutual, she added. And that's why I'm so scared to tell him how I feel. Because, Enid, I'm afraid he won't want to let go. And if that happens, I don't know what I'll do.